The Dusk of Hapsburg. The creaking and straining system of the Austro-Hungarian Empire revolved ponderously around the person of the aged emperor. Franz Joseph had ascended his throne in 1848, amid executions, martial law, and the rigorous suppression of revolt. He had sustained every kind of public tribulation and domestic tragedy. His brother, the Emperor Maximilian, had been executed in Mexico by a rebel firing party. His only son Rudolf, heir to the throne, had perished tragically in 1889. His wife had been stabbed through the heart on a jetty at Geneva by an Italian anarchist. He had never declared a foreign war he did not lose, nor bent himself to a domestic policy which was not evidently failing. In 1859, the fields of Solferino and Magenta had stripped him of North Italy. In 1866, the Battle of Sadowa had transferred the hegemony of Germany from Austria to Prussia. Hungary, against whom he had warred with severity, asserted a challenging separatism in the heart of the empire. Bohemia, whom he would never recognize as a partner, chafed bitterly under the hands. However, he lived and thrived. He had sat on the throne for more than 60 years when King Edward VII died. At 75, he was not only well preserved, but vigorous. He walked far. He could still ride. His chief amusement was shooting boar, and bears, and deer. He had borne his bereavement stoically. He was jealous of his brother Maximilian. He did not love his wife. He had been on bad terms with all his family, some of whom had incurred a public notoriety which by his rigid standards was beyond any pardon. He politely acquiesced in the existence of his nephew, the new heir, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but he could never forgive him for his love marriage. General Marchenko, Russian military attaché at Vienna from 1905 to 1911, in memoirs which are a definite contribution to history, says that a colleague, Major von Bülow, the German attaché, remarked upon the emperor's troubles. He is used to all that. Without a misfortune in the day's work, he would be bored. Marchenko himself says that Franz Joseph regarded his defeats and reverses as sacrifices to fortune. A courtly, sagacious, crabbed, disillusioned old gentleman, reared in the purple, harassed from youth up by awful public responsibilities, with an ever-present self-questioning about their adequate discharge. In the closing phase of his reign, he had become almost an automaton. He discharged routine duties without pleasure, indeed with distaste. Punctually and assiduously, literally from dawn to dusk, he rose usually at 4 a.m. and dressed in his sky blue uniform, drank his coffee at his desk, amid official portfolios and files. His wish was to go to sleep not later than 8 o'clock at night. He resented keenly all functions which interrupted this rule. When compelled to entertain company, he dined as late as 5 or even 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Otherwise, although in Vienna the usual hour was between 8 and 9 o'clock, the emperor took his evening meal between 3 and 4. Alone upon his rocky pinnacle, from which the tides of time had sunk, this venerable, conscientious functionary continued in harness, pulling faithfully at the collar, mostly in the right direction, to the last gasp. The Emperor's Circle. A living picture of the court is given by Baron von Margutti, who was for the last 17 years of the empire high in the household. Franz Joseph lived in intimacy with a curious small coterie consisting of 2 septuagenarian aides-de-camps, Count Parr and Baron Bolfras, who was also chief of the military cabinet, and Count Beck, 70 years of age in 1906, and perhaps the emperor's one trusted male friend. All these 3 men stood around the centre of power. They had dwelt there before most of Franz Joseph's subjects had been born. Their lives were wrapped up in the service of the emperor. Parr, ably served by younger men, dealt with all the questions, great and small, of etiquette and a large part of patronage. Bolfras presided over the court side of the military, but he brooded over higher matters of policy, had constant occasions to give his advice, and indeed claims to have both counselled and planned in 1878 the original occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Beck, who had served the emperor for 50 years in 1906, managed and looked after all the movements and public appearances of his beloved master. He knew exactly how he liked reviews, manoeuvres, inspections of camps or garrisons, and every non-political public activity to be conducted. He studied the imperial wants and idiosyncrasies. He protected his sovereign from every kind of minor annoyance. He also, no doubt, supplied him with a stream of antiquated opinion upon military matters, for he had been, in his day, chief of the staff of the Austro-Hungarian army. Such was this ancient band of survivors, eminently Victorian, unswervingly faithful, who surrounded the very old but clear-headed potentate, in whose person all the loyalties of a disrupting empire centred, and against whose regime all its hatreds welled. An imperial friendship. The emperor and one other confidant, Katharina Schratt, the daughter of a postmaster in Baden, near Vienna, had been in the 80s a successful actress. Franz Joseph admired her beauty, charm and humour. The empress welcomed her. She became associated with the court. For over 30 years she was the emperor's cherished friend. Whether at Schönbrunn or Ilsch, her discreet dwelling was always close at hand. Very early in the mornings, the old gentleman would leave his palace by the private door, and walking by carefully secluded paths, would breakfast with Frau Schratt, always good-tempered and smiling, in an old-fashioned room with a white cloth table, gay with flowers. Here he found peace, happiness, and a window on the world, which none of his punctually handled portfolios would have given him. Frau von Schratt, as she came to be called, was extremely well informed upon all kinds of public and social matters. Ministers, bankers, nobles and actors found it both wise and agreeable to keep in touch with her. She was the link between the emperor and the outer world. She was his newspaper. From her he learnt more than from all his ministers put together. It was often only from her that he learnt the truth. Indeed, on the tragic morning when the suicide or murder of the emperor's only son had to be announced to him, it was to Frau von Schratt that the Empress Elizabeth turned, and the two women went together to break the news. This gifted woman, who had within limits the power to make and mar, remained always a private figure. She never abused her position to amass a fortune or aggrandize herself. She spoke to the emperor on matters of state with tact and modesty. But she knew how to tell him what she believed was for his good, and he was always ready to listen and ponder on all she said. Her influence was jealously resented by the court chamberlain, the Count of Monte Verneo, the guardian of etiquette and correctitude. He laboured continually to disturb the relationship between her and his imperial master, but he laboured without success. The companionship was Franz Joseph's only happiness. He held tenaciously to it to the very end. It remains to be said that the emperor, of course, was a strong conservative. He thought that old-fashioned habits and methods and a conservative outlook were enjoined upon him by his position and by the complicated texture of his empire. He did not conceal his abhorrence of innovation. He would never use a lift, avowed dislike for electrical appliances, detested the telephone, only rode in a motor car to please King Edward, and disapproved of flying. All we can say with our superior knowledge is that in these unfashionable opinions he has not yet been proved wrong. The heir to the throne. The death of the Crown Prince Rudolph in 1889 transferred the succession to the Emperor's brother Charles, and on the latter's death in 1896 it passed to his eldest son, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The heir apparent had the advantage of being educated without any expectation of the throne. He was a fine-looking man of moderate ability, simple tastes, tactless manners, a sincere character, and a strong will. From his maternal grandfather, the Bomb King of Sicily, he inherited a distrust of strangers and a tendency to believe himself disliked. It is said of him that he once remarked to his chief of staff, "You generally expect that every man will prove an angel. For my part, I always assume that anyone I see for the first time is a scoundrel, and later on, if possible, I revise my opinion." At the castle of the Archduke Frederick at Pressburg, he was a welcome guest, because it was hoped he might marry the eldest daughter. However, it was gradually suspected that his interest was engaged by a young maid of honour a German Czech lady of honourable but not elevated parentage, Countess Chotek. Cross-questioned by her mistress, the Archduchess Isabella, the Countess Chotek disposed of these rumours by a complete denial. But one day, during a holiday by the Adriatic, the Archduchess picked up by chance a locket dropped unwittingly by its owner. She opened the locket and found therein a miniature of Franz Ferdinand with the inscription, "Thine forever." She recognised the locket as usually worn by the Countess Chotek. His marriage. No time was lost in dismissing the maid of honour. The sequel startled the Austrian world. Franz Ferdinand, considering that he had compromised a young lady and involved her in disgrace and dismissal, gave full rein to the passion of his life. He announced at once that he would marry her. The old emperor, who had planned to wed his new heir to the widow of his son Rudolph, the Crown Princess Stephanie, was deeply shocked. Vienna was thrilled, and the dual monarchy agog. A score of obstacles, arguments and vetoes were interposed. Franz Ferdinand crashed through them all. He signed an act of renunciation of any right to the throne for his future wife and children. He was ready to renounce it for himself if need be. The marriage took place. This was the greatest, the happiest, and the grandest event of his life. They were a devoted couple, inseparable in life and death. However, persistent and renewing complications disturbed the rigid etiquette of the imperial court. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a figure of the highest importance, and as the emperor aged, he was bound to play an ever-increasing and almost dominant part in the politics and military affairs of the empire. There was one key which always unlocked his regard. The ceremonial treatment accorded to his wife was for him decisive. She was by Hungarian law, whose generous principles considered only the fact of marriage, bound to become Queen of Hungary on her husband's accession to the empire. In Austria, however, her precedence was lowly and kept lowly, and embarrassing situations arose at every public function at which both sexes were present. With the birth of his children, the Archduke found a new incentive. He looked back with remorse upon his oath of renunciation of their rights. Ease would retract vows made in pain as violent and void. To procure for his loved ones the recognition which he deemed their due became the paramount objective of his life. The Countess Chotek fanned this flame incessantly. The woman's ambition, said the suffragan Bishop of Vienna, is unbridled, and her unusual intelligence will soon show her the way to translate it into actual fact. The Kaiser William was not slow to pick up the obvious key and fit it in the all-important lock. Before his marriage, Franz Ferdinand was antagonistic to the Germans, hated the Kaiser, and spoke of him with even more than his usual candour. But William II took pains. Whenever he passed through Vienna, it was to the Countess Chotek that he paid special attention. Friendship was soon established. Franz Ferdinand and his wife, invited to Berlin, were entertained with every possible honour. At the banquet, the adoption of small round tables enabled the Kaiser to place the Countess at his side without departing from the rules. Compliments and courtesies were unceasing. The Countess Chotek, who was a charming woman, amiable, capable and discreet, became a German partisan. She spoke of the Kaiser in terms of the highest regard and admiration. She had no difficulty in carrying her husband with her. He discarded his former prejudices, and from 1908 or 1909, the two men were close friends. The old emperor continued to disapprove the marriage, but as the weight of years descended upon him, resigned himself to events. Meanwhile, the charge of the imperial army and the navy devolved upon the heir apparent, and in spite of the prejudices and resistances of Franz Joseph and his ancient military cabinet, very considerable reforms were introduced into the army, especially in the artillery, and it was gradually Germanised and furnished with modern weapons and young leaders. Konrad von Hotzendorf. Foremost among these new chiefs stood, to give him for the first and last time his full title, General of Infantry, Franz Freiherr Konrad von Hotzendorf. In 1914, his name was scarcely known outside his own country. Even during the conflict,
his repute did not extend outside purely military circles. The large agitated publics who devoured the war news in France, England or America, never heard of him. Nevertheless, he played a greater part in the World War, and in its origins, than any other of the 60 million subjects of the Hapsburg Empire. He was in fact the commander of all their armies during the greater part of the war. He made the plans, he conducted the mobilization, and fought almost all the battles. He went beyond these important duties. He was a diplomat as well as a soldier, a politician as well as a strategist. Indeed, it is said by those who knew him that he was a politician first and a soldier second. He represented the most dangerous of combinations, a chief of the general staff absorbed in foreign policy. What Ludendorff became in 1917, Conrad was already some 10 years earlier. Born in 1852, the son of a colonel of hussars, Conrad mounted steadily the grades of the Austrian army. As a lecturer and a writer upon tactics and military training, he was one of the apostles of the offensive, for whom machine guns and barbed wire had prepared so many dissolutions. In 1906, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand entrusted him with the reorganisation of the imperial armies and marked him out for the first military position both in peace and war. Conrad was inspired in his duties by an intense realisation of the dire and increasing peril of the empire. He saw it racked at home by racial stresses and surrounded by fierce, powerful and hungry foreign foes. Russia, Italy, Romania and above all Serbia seemed to him enemies who waited but for the chance to fall upon the dying empire and carve their fortunes from its body. Russia coveted Galicia, Romania aimed at Transylvania, Italy sought the redemption of Tyrol and the Adriatic coast, while Serbia, aspiring to found with Russian sympathy a great kingdom for the southern Slavs, seemed to Conrad the most malignant and hateful of all. It cannot be denied that when the time came, all these countries proved themselves mortal enemies of the Austrian Empire, nor that they all invaded or threatened the provinces on which their hearts were set, nor that 3 out of the 4 have gained their objectives in the main, if not to the full. The Preacher of War. Studying these strategic problems as a soldier, Conrad convinced himself that if all his country's enemies combined, ruin was certain. He wished therefore to fight them one by one. We must, he said, take the first opportunity of reckoning with our most vulnerable enemy, lest our foes deliver a blow. He was for knocking out each enemy as occasion arose, so as to be sure that they would not all set upon Austria simultaneously. He believed in preventative wars, and was convinced Austria could fight 2 or 3 in succession. First Italy, then Serbia, and so on. For nearly 10 years he laid siege to the emperor. His persistency often offended his master, and his sincerity and ability won him renewed opportunities to offend. In the end, he had his way. Constant dropping wears away stone. His power of work surpassed his physical strength. Accustomed to mountain air from long service in Tyrol, he felt stifled in his room at the Ministry of War. In the frosts of winter, he worked with his windows open and his visitors caught cold. He was stern with himself, that he might be more stern with others. He courted toil and privation, and inflicted them readily upon his troops. Indeed, at the manoeuvres a year before, he pressed the army so hard that the Archduke was forced to remonstrate. It is not necessary, said Franz Ferdinand, to teach the soldiers to die in time of peace. This dark, small, frail, thin officer, with piercing and expressive eyes, set in the face of the ascetic, austere, in his way of living, fearless of men and events, devoted to his profession and to the emperor, consumed with anxiety for his country, dwelt year after year at the very centre of Europe's powder magazine, in special charge of the detonators.